Just imagine, a freezing night, a luxury car parked in a dark corner, and a boy, only 8 years old, shivering and hungry, hiding in the back seat. Pedro just wanted to escape the cold, and maybe, just for one night, forget that he's all alone in the world ever since he lost his mother. When morning breaks, Augusto, the millionaire who owns the car, arrives in a rush, ready for another busy day. But when he opens the door and sees that small, curled-up body hugging an old backpack, he's stunned. What is this boy doing in my car? Augusto is furious, threatens to call the police. But then something else catches his eye. The boy is gripping an old photo hanging from a chain, a face that makes Augusto's heart skip a beat. Who is this child? Why does that photo look so familiar? And what is Augusto going to do now? Kick Pedro out? Or listen to what fate is trying to tell him? Stay with me, because this story will turn upside down everything you thought you knew about love, forgiveness, and family. The night was so cold it felt like it was slicing through Pedro's skin. He hugged his knees to his chest, trying to shrink himself as much as he could under the awning. The old, shapeless backpack, worn from years of use, was the only embrace he had left. He pulled the zipper halfway, as if opening it all the way would let what little remained inside slip out. All he had were some rolled-up clothes, nothing that would keep out the wind, but it was all he owned. Still, he clung to it tightly, as if his mother's last piece was hidden there. The street never really slept. Even when everything seemed still, there was always the sound of a car, a bus letting out smoke, people arguing quietly under another awning, hurried footsteps on the wet asphalt. But of all these, Pedro was only silence. He hardly spoke to anyone. Sometimes he asked for coins, but people hurried by, heads down, pretending not to see him. Sometimes anger welled up, but sadness always followed, heavy and overwhelming, bigger than any rage. Tonight, the wind was even harsher. The cold felt like it came from inside, not just from outside. Pedro closed his eyes and tried to picture his mother's face. It was funny how over time, memories fade, like old film. But there was always one unchanging image, her smiling, playing with the chain around his neck. "Promise you'll never take it off," son, she'd say. And he promised, not really knowing why. His stomach growled so loudly that, for a moment, he worried someone might hear. It had been at least 2 days since he'd eaten properly. He'd found a stale piece of bread in the trash and shared it with a scrawny dog that appeared out of nowhere. The dog was long gone, but Pedro remembered the grateful way it wagged its tail. That made him want to cry. Even the stray dog was something to miss. He didn't want much. Just a warm place, a simple meal, someone who would look at him, really see him, the way his mother did. With eyes full of love, not disgust, not pity. Just love. The city felt even colder because no one looked at each other. The tall buildings, with lights glowing far overhead, seemed like another world entirely. Pedro imagined what they were like inside. Maybe people complaining because the heater made it too hot, or the food was bad, or their clothes weren't new enough to go out. It was strange to think about. It seemed impossible that, just across the street, life could be so very different. He didn't even know how he'd make it to tomorrow. His hands were red, nearly purple, but he hardly felt them anymore. The wind cut right through his clothes, as if he wasn't wearing anything. And in those moments, everything inside him screamed. Why did she have to go? Why does the world have to be so big, so full of people, and yet he was utterly alone? He tried to be strong, remembering his mother's words, never lose hope, but sometimes it was impossible. Off in the distance, car lights flashed by. Now and then, a driver stopped at the light, a few glued to their phones, others shuffling papers. No one paid attention to a kid curled up on the sidewalk, as if he were just another piece of trash to ignore. Each time Pedro noticed this, his heart clenched even tighter. Sometimes a woman selling flowers passed by. Tonight, even she didn't show up. That meant the cold was truly relentless. If someone like her, who always smiled and said good evening, couldn't stay out, Pedro knew it would be a long night. He pulled his feet up onto his bit of cardboard, trying to keep warm, but it did no good. He shut his eyes and tried to imagine he was under his old blanket, his mother whispering fairy tales in his ear. That tomorrow there'd be bread and coffee, that school would have recess. But he was lying to himself. It didn't even make him sad anymore. He'd gotten used to forgetting. A car stopped nearby, and for a moment, Pedro held his breath. Sometimes adults came, yelling at him to get lost, sometimes tossing coins, rarely saying anything kind. This time, the engine just shut off and someone went into a building. Still, Pedro stayed alert, eyeing everything carefully. He'd learned quickly when to run and when to stay hidden. A man in a big jacket walked by, not even glancing. The strong smell of cigarettes lingered for a while, almost making Pedro cough. It was always like that. People hurrying by, lost in their own world, their own cold. The church bell chimed, far away. Midnight. Sleep came in fits, never the whole restful kind. He was afraid to fall deeply asleep and have someone take his backpack. More afraid still to wake up and see, once again, that nothing had changed. Then it started to drizzle. Fine rain. It dripped off the awning, cold as needles against his skin. He couldn't take it anymore. His chest hurt from hunger, from longing, from fear. He thought about asking for help, but had lost faith. So many had promised to return, to bring bread, to call a shelter, but they never came back. Just more broken promises. There was a faint, dying spark of hope in his eyes, nearly snuffed out, but not gone. It was a bruised hope, battered by the world, but still alive. He looked up at the dark sky, felt a tear blend with the rain, and whispered, "Mom, just somewhere warm. That's all I want today." So he stayed, curled in on himself, trying to get lost inside his own head so he wouldn't have to feel anything anymore. The wind whipped against him. Pedro shook, but it wasn't just from the cold. It was a loneliness that wouldn't go away. Pedro stood on that sidewalk for a long time, watching the empty street, the distant lights and tall buildings. Fewer and fewer cars passed. He rubbed his hands up and down his arms, trying to push away the cold slicing deep into his bones. The icy wind left his fingertips raw and red, but no matter how small he tried to make himself, the pain wouldn't let him go. His stomach gave another loud rumble, a growl that seemed to echo through the night silence. He lowered his head, ashamed even of his own body. Tears would come just from thinking about his mother, but he didn't want the few passers-by to see. So he took a deep breath, squeezed his eyes shut for a moment. He just wanted a blanket, to stop being afraid. As the breeze turned colder still, Pedro started searching the streets around him, eyes full of hopelessness. He scanned building doors, shop entrances. All locked, all clean and far away from him. Until, there in the corner, just in the shadow of a tree, he spotted a black car. It was huge. It shone under the streetlight, despite the streaks of road dust on the hood. It looked like something from a movie. He'd never been this close to a car like that. He kept watching. No one was nearby, just some scraps blowing across the ground. On the other side of the street, a security guard lit a cigarette, distracted. Pedro got closer, moving quietly, hardly daring to breathe. This car was different. Big wheels, tinted windows. He peered in. Inside, everything looked soft and so clean. So unlike anything he'd ever known. He thought about the other street kids, the angry adults, the shouting, the slaps whenever someone tried to find a sheltered spot. But no one would yell at him here. It didn't look dangerous. But the fear pressed in hard. His heart pounded so loud he felt sure someone outside would hear. But the cold was worse, and exhaustion weighed him down, heavy as iron in his legs. He tried the back door handle, half expecting an alarm to screech, for something to throw him out. But it just clicked softly and opened. The smell of new leather hit him, a world away from wet concrete and cardboard. He slipped in on his side, like he wanted to hide from his own shadow. The old backpack clutched to his chest. He closed the door so softly he barely touched it. Inside it was dark. Only the streetlights crept through the windows. Pedro froze, not moving a muscle, listening to his own breath. He was afraid someone would spot him, that someone would shout, that he'd be kicked out yet again. But it was warm, so much warmer. Just that was enough to make him want to cry again, this time from relief. He looked around. He'd never seen seats so soft. He laid his head down slowly. The leather was smooth, cold at first, but better than damp cardboard. The stitching was perfect, nothing torn, everything clean. It all felt forbidden for someone like him. But no one yelled. No one told him to leave. Pedro pulled his legs up, shrinking himself as small as possible. He curled up tight, knees against his chest. He held onto his backpack, listening for any sound from the street. If someone shows up, I'll say I just wanted to hide from the cold. But who would believe that? The thought pressed hard in his chest. His hands were red. He tucked one under his shirt for warmth. With the other, he gripped the little chain around his neck. The photo inside was already worn, but it was all he had left of his mother. He pressed his forehead to it, closed his eyes tight. Made a quiet wish, not even sure to who. Just one more night, just one more warm night, please. Outside, the wind picked up. A few drops of rain began tapping the car roof, as if the whole world was quietly crying with Pedro. Still, in here, he was safe at least for a while. A distant horn made him shrink further, but no one looked toward the car. The silence deepened. Sometimes, silence hurts more than any shout, because it feels like the world has forgotten you. Pedro squeezed into the seat, his exhaustion heavier than ever. His eyelids drooped, despite his efforts to stay alert. The fear was still there, but his body was spent. Sleep rolled over him, heavy and strong. He thought of his mother again, her arms around him, the sweet smell of her hair. He remembered falling asleep in her lap, her hand brushing his hair. Now, just the cold seat, a far cry from their little bed, but better than the hard ground. It was shelter. It was a chance. He'd hear footsteps now and then outside. A couple laughed loudly, a bottle clattered across the sidewalk. Pedro went still, barely breathing. But no one saw him, no one cared. Fear gradually turned into quiet sadness. He pulled his backpack under his head as a pillow. He was sleeping in a luxury car, but felt smaller than ever. Even so, he closed his eyes. Left the cold outside, for just a moment. Sleep came slowly, wrapped in his mother's memories. An improvised refuge in the freezing night. It wasn't much, but to Pedro, it was everything. Suddenly, the rain began. At first, just a gentle tapping, as if someone drummed softly on the metal roof, then quickly turning to a hurried percussion song overhead. The sky darkened further, the street lights becoming blurry smudges in the wet glass. Pedro stayed there, curled up in the back seat. The seat was soft, but he couldn't relax completely. It was like sleeping in a forbidden place, feeling guilty for even breathing too loudly. Every little noise chilled him, footsteps outside, an engine revving, a motorcycle backfiring. Each sound sent his heart racing, like a hunted animal ready to run again. He clung to his tattered backpack like a shield. Inside wasn't much, some dirty clothes, a battered notebook, a plastic box with stale cookies that barely tasted like anything anymore. But it was his everything he owned. He hugged it close, as if someone might steal even this. Around his neck, Pedro held the little silver chain tight, without even realizing. The metal was cold in his hand. Inside was his mother's photo, worn at the corners. Just looking at it made him want to cry, and yet, it was also like hearing her voice telling him not to give up, not now, not after all this. He ran his thumb over her face, trying to remember the smell of her hair, her laughter at breakfast. The emptiness was sharp, but he forced himself to believe she was still watching him from somewhere above. While rain beat down, Pedro drifted into sleep. But not the deep, dreamless sleep that wipes away all the bad things. This was broken rest, shards stirring inside his head. He mumbled in his dreams, called for his mother, his voice thin, cracking. A sad whisper, "Mom, come back. Don't go." His chest rose and fell slowly, air catching each time he remembered, even in sleep. Outside, no one cared. Cars rolled by, people hurried under umbrellas, never looking around. Streetlights shimmered in the puddles, sometimes a wet cat slipped across the road. Nothing changed, no one saw the invisible boy hiding just to breathe a bit of warmth. Inside the car was another world. Warm, silent. The smell was different, a mix of leather and fancy cologne, so strong it almost made him sick at first, but later he got used to it. He was so tired he barely cared anymore. He just wanted to stay a little longer, without anyone telling him to run. In the car's darkness, every flash of headlights from the street seemed to light up his memories. At one point he woke with a start to thunder. Sat up, panicked, searching around. Eyes wide, sure he was in trouble, that someone had found him. But he was still alone, just rain and the roar of a bus hitting a giant puddle outside. It took a while for him to calm down again. He squeezed the chain so tight it nearly hurt his hand, as if it could ward off all bad things. Tears came without warning. Not loud sobs, just the quiet, leaking kind, when your chest can't take it anymore. You wipe them away quick with the back of your hand, afraid of appearing weaker still. He thought of his mother, of sleeping glued to her in their narrow bed, her voice whispering, "It'll get better, little one. I'm here." But she wasn't. Only the photo, the cold chain, and a desperate wish not to disappear entirely. Sometimes, he had strange dreams. His mother would climb into the car and sit beside him, stroke his hair and smile like always. In his dreams, everything was light, warm, smelling of sweet bread. He'd laugh, cling to her, promise to behave, say he'd stop running away and fighting for scraps. Then the dream ended. The seat became just an unfamiliar car seat again. His breath fogged the glass, his body began shivering once more. He woke up scared, feeling like he was falling into a bottomless pit. Looked around, lost, unsure if it was night or day, listening to the dashboard clock tick quietly. Despite everything, curled and tightly, hungry, Pedro tried his hardest to stay still. didn't want to give anyone a reason to get angry. He already knew the world moved faster than he ever could, that things slipped through your fingers. All that was left was to wait for morning and hope no one got mad that he'd borrowed this little corner, just for one night. Outside, life carried on, and different. People yelling at the bus stop, drivers honking at the flooding in the next street over, Mrs. Vera slamming her gate without even noticing the black car parked there. Only the hidden boy, shivering and dreaming behind the seat, felt that time was standing still. That was how the night went. Each sigh, each time he called for his mother with no voice, the rain drumming like impatient fingers. Pedro had no idea that very night, his life was about to change. But for now, all he really knew was that the pain and longing seemed endless. And despite that, he clung to hope, right there in the middle of his fear. No one else saw it, but that street kid, unknown, unwanted, spent the night surrounded by broken dreams and whispered promises in the cold darkness of an unfamiliar car. Dawn hadn't even broken yet when Augusto was up, glaring at his watch. He hated being late, and just thinking about the traffic on this Monday morning stoked his growing impatience. He grabbed his briefcase, fixed his tie in the living room mirror, ignored the breakfast the housekeeper left out, and strode toward the garage. The air in the garage was cold and damp, with a strange scent of wet concrete mixed with his expensive cologne. The harsh ceiling lights made everything look even chillier. Only the sound of Augusto's shoes tapping rhythmically on the slick floor broke the silence, while the rain kept tapping faintly overhead. He took a deep breath before opening the car door, already running through in his head everything he'd say to that important client in this morning's meeting. The leather seats were cold. He tossed his briefcase onto the passenger seat, muttered something about always forgetting to leave the heater on, sat down, buckled up, and started the engine. Augusto didn't even look behind him, didn't notice the ragged backpack lying half on the backseat floor. All he thought about was his packed schedule, his to-do list, the calls he needed to make as soon as the gridlock died down. He grabbed his phone, fired off a quick message to his secretary, "Tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes, and let out a long, tired sigh, half a confession. Outside, the rain thickened again. Droplets slid down the window, leaving streaks, blurring the still-lit streetlights. Everything was gray, silent, the kind of chill that got into your bones. Inside the car, only the low hum of the engine and the faint whoosh of the vent broke the quiet. Augusto caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror. He saw the stern face, dark circles under his eyes, proof of too many sleepless nights. He felt old, drained, irritable without knowing exactly why. Sometimes he missed something, but couldn't name it. So he pretended he didn't feel anything at all and slipped back into autopilot. His fingers drummed the steering wheel, impatient. He didn't notice the small body curled up behind him, the bare feet hidden to keep from being seen between the seats. Pedro, tucked up like a frightened bird, hardly breathed. The boy clutched his chain tight to his chest, eyes half closed, trying not to make a sound. His heart beat so fast it felt like it could break out of his chest. The car smelled different. Everything was new to Pedro. The leather, the mix of perfume and gasoline, the faint warmth from the vents when the engine started. For a moment, he forgot he was hiding. He just felt relief, being dry, sheltered from the wind that would slice his skin outside. But even so, he couldn't really sleep. He dreamed of his mother, heard the rain, and sometimes jolted awake, sure he'd be found. Augusto, completely oblivious, grew annoyed at a car horn outside. He grabbed his phone again, a message from his ex-business partner, another fresh argument still swirling in his mind. He wanted to yell at the world, but just muttered, dragged a hand down his face, tightened his seatbelt, ready to face another day exactly like every other, where nothing and no one was allowed to disrupt his plans. Strange how two worlds could be so close, almost touching, without noticing each other. Augusto's face was hard, his eyes shut to anything that wasn't business. Pedro had hope, fear, a bravery far too big for such a small child. He trembled, hugging his backpack. Inside, his mother's old coat, 2 stale hunks of bread, and the chain with an old photo tucked under his shirt. That was everything he owned. Silence again, broken just by rain and the engine rumbling to life. In the back seat, Pedro prayed the man wouldn't notice him, not until the rain stopped, or until he found enough strength to figure out what to do next. He had nowhere to go, but he'd never had the luxury of stopping to think. He was always running, always hiding, hoping hunger wouldn't win first. Augusto's hand gripped the steering wheel. He remembered old fights, his ex-wife's face floating in and out, broken promises and silences bigger than the house itself. He wondered why everyone seemed to want something from him, except peace. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, counted to 3. In the back, Pedro heard fingers drumming, the seat shifting, the man's silent gulp. Every small sound was enormous to him. Fear made him tremble, but he bit his lip and stayed put. He didn't want to face the cold again, didn't want more rain, more emptiness. The boy stared out the window, watched the world blurred by raindrops, wondered if luck would ever be on his side, if someone would really see him one day. In that instant, everything was lining up for what was about to happen. Neither had any idea how much this morning would turn their worlds upside down, how close the past was to shaking loose. But now, there was just silence, rain, expectation. A man armored with pride and old wounds, a child fragile with hope and fear, sharing the same air, the same space. Not knowing their lives would never be the same. It began just like any other morning or almost. Augusto was in his usual hurry, checking the time, stern expression, briefcase under his arm, already glued to his phone as he unlocked the car. The cold clung to the windows, a thin mist outside. In the backseat, a rumpled blanket he didn't recognize. He assumed the cleaning lady left it there. But when he started the car, he heard a small sound, a muffled sigh, almost a sob. At first, Augusto just sat still, confused. He turned slowly, irritation rising. And then he saw there was a boy curled up there, hair wild, knees pressed to his chest and shivering. Like a cornered animal. He gripped a battered backpack as if it was a treasure. His huge, light-swallowing brown eyes stared at Augusto, full of fear. Time stopped for a few seconds. Augusto blinked, thinking he was seeing things. But no, it was real. And when Augusto opened his mouth, everything unraveled. "What are you doing here?" he barked, voice deep, already raising his phone. "I'm calling the police. Do you hear me? Speak up. Get out of my car." The boy jolted. So terrified he looked like he might curl up and disappear. Silent tears streamed down his dirty cheeks. His small hands clung even tighter to the backpack, old fabric nearly tearing under his grip. "I'm sorry, sir." He could barely look up, his voice tiny, strangled with fear. "It was just for a little while. It's so cold outside. I swear, I didn't take anything. I just wanted to sleep." Augusto stood frozen, torn between shouting, throwing the child out, calling the police for real. His instincts screamed at him to end this quickly. But something in the boy's voice stopped him. The tone, the trembling, a truth so raw there was no defense. And for a split second, Augusto's mind flashed to his own mother's face, something ancient, forgotten, almost buried. Silence filled the car. Outside, the city was just waking up. A few horns blared. Vendors were setting up stalls on the sidewalk. The wind whistled softly. Inside, it was just the two of them, each one trying to understand the other. Pedro was still shaking, his hands red from the cold and from shame. His nose was running, but he wiped it with the sleeve of his thin jacket. His eyes were wide, bracing for the worst. And Augusto glared at him with more anger than genuine intent. He hated feeling pity, hated connecting, hated remembering old hurts. But that look was different. It wasn't just ordinary fear. It was a fear that begged for help without knowing how to ask. The boy seemed to know there was no one out there waiting for him. If he got out of that car, all there was for him was the cold street once again. "My car's not a shelter. I have somewhere to be. You understand? A kid on the street like this. Where are your parents?" Augusto tried to keep his voice cold, as if this had nothing to do with him. But even he noticed his tone waver on the last question. The boy said nothing. He simply bit his lip and looked away. Only then did Augusto notice the little necklace wrapped around Pedro's hand, a flimsy old chain with a small round medal. He didn't think much of it, figured it was junk. But it left him with a strange discomfort, like the itch of a painful memory inside his chest. Augusto shifted, not sure where to place his hands. He straightened his jacket, looked up at the ceiling, turned the key again just to feel in control. The boy still didn't move. Only his stomach made a tiny noise, the sound of hunger mixed with nerves. "I'm not going to give you money. Don't bother crying." Pedro shook his head fast, tears streaking his face but a stubborn dignity shining faintly behind them. "I don't want money. I just didn't want to die from the cold." That sentence echoed in Augusto's head. He'd seen poverty, he'd seen kids asking for money too. But someone saying that, with that sincerity, didn't want to die from the cold, hit differently. He took a deep breath, suddenly wishing he could shut off the world, cancel his day, vanish from himself. But he knew, right then, he was face to face with someone life had already rejected long ago. In the fogged-up window, Augusto saw the boy's reflection. A small, smudged face. the necklace glinting a little more in a stray beam of light. This wasn't just a lost child. There was something else, a secret, a past knocking on the door that he'd tried never to hear. Inside, Augusto trembled, not from anger or cold. Something else. A long-buried shame, a childish fear of pitying someone. Part of him wanted to scream or push the boy away. But another part, the part he thought was dead, wanted to ask if the boy was hurt, if he was hungry, if he wanted a better blanket. Out in the street, traffic was starting to jam up. Time was passing, yet Augusto was stuck there. 2 lives, 2 worlds, inside a car that was too hot within and too cold outside. And the boy's look, desperate, pure, tired, seemed to ask for more than shelter. It seemed to ask for a chance. Still in a near whisper, Pedro said, almost apologetically, "I can leave, if you want, sir." "I'm sorry, mister. I don't know where else to go." The request hung heavy in the air. Augusto just blinked slowly, knowing something inside him had shifted. Not realizing yet, in that moment, that this morning wasn't just different, it was the beginning of everything he most needed to face. Augusto stayed there, rooted by the open car door, his hands still clutching the keys. The boy, much too skinny, face smudged, was gathering his filthy backpack off the seat, his hands shaking. He curled in on himself, like Augusto's anger might explode at any second. Augusto tried to be stern, to summon that forceful meeting room voice, but something in his throat stuck. "Go on. Come on. Just get out," he muttered, not really sure if he wanted the boy to leave. Pedro hugged his backpack and looked over his shoulder, a mix of fear and shame. Tears shimmered in his eyes, but he tried to hold them back, biting his lip. The silvery chain swung as he stepped carefully off the seat, doing his best not to draw attention to the mess he left behind. At the end of the chain, a picture, small, its edges worn, a woman with dark hair and a wide smile. Augusto froze, holding his breath for a second. That photograph folded time inside him. Her face was changed, but unmistakable. That lively expression. The shape of her brow, her eyes. It couldn't be. For a moment, Augusto forgot where he was. His mouth went dry, his heart picking up speed. Anger had nothing to do with it. It was something else, a mix of breathlessness and forgotten longing. The boy sensed the silence, turned wary, his hand covering the necklace like a hidden treasure. He shot a quick, apologetic glance at Augusto, then darted onto the sidewalk, scurrying off far too small under his old jacket. Augusto didn't even call out. He just watched Pedro disappear among the cars, as the street was already filling with hurried people. The cold rushed into the car, biting at the exposed skin of his neck, but Augusto didn't mind. He sat there, the image of the woman in the photo stuck somewhere behind his eyes. He couldn't remember how deep he'd buried that memory, but now it was as if the whole city had grown quieter. Even the buses sounded farther away. Why would a child have that photo? Who was this boy, really? The scent the boy left in the car, rain, street, damp clothes, lingered. Augusto settled back behind the wheel, but didn't turn the key. He closed his eyes for a moment, felt the cold leather at his back. Tried to think only about work, the meeting, all the things that were supposed to matter, but every now and then, like a flash, the woman's smiling face returned. Augusto rubbed his own face hard, irritated with himself. There was a twinge in his chest, just like hearing certain songs by accident. He cursed himself inwardly. This wasn't the time for nostalgia, for old wounds. But there was no escaping it. In his mind, he couldn't shake the image of the boy's frightened eyes. Eyes just like hers, when something hurt too much and she tried to hide it. He tried to reason, business style. A street problem, let the police handle it. But even as he picked up his phone to call, he found himself holding it longer than necessary. The words stuck in his throat. His own reflection in the window looked odd, tired. Why, out of all the street kids, did that boy have to show up right here, in his car, this morning, wearing that photo around his neck? Outside, the morning stayed gray. Windy. Some flecks from the last drizzle still clung to the glass. Horns honked in irritation, but he hardly heard them. In Augusto's mind there was only one image looping. Pedro, shivering, clutching his backpack, the silver chain tied around his wrist. He remembered her telling a secret quietly, laughing nervously, years ago. "If I ever disappear, promise you'll remember me?" Augusto never really answered. He swallowed hard, feeling a kind of pain he'd forgotten existed. A desperate wish to turn back time, to change the ending. The weight of those memories tangled with the discomfort of not knowing. He felt a silent battle inside, wanting to rid himself of this feeling, but also desperate to understand why the boy had that photo. Curiosity grew. He wanted to know who Pedro was, who the mother was. Was she alive? Did the boy have anyone besides that backpack and the photo? But outwardly, he showed nothing. Just sat there, breathing slow, trying to regain control. He picked up a business card, looked at his phone, but his hands were cold, heavy. He stared through the misted glass, and for the first time in years, wished he wasn't alone, even if it was just for a few minutes. He closed his eyes again, wondering what kind of man he'd become after everything. Pedro's terrified look wouldn't leave his mind, nor the photo, nor her smile. And as much as Augusto tried to convince himself that the boy wasn't his problem, he knew, deep down, that something inside him had changed. Augusto couldn't concentrate on anything. It was as if the whole office had suddenly changed color. People rushed past the corridor, typing, coughing, asking him questions. But his head was somewhere else, stuck on that cold street, in the backseat of his own car, with that frightened boy. He held his phone in his hand, but had no idea what he'd just read in the email. The clock on the wall, near the huge glass window, already showed almost 10:30. He was late for the most important meeting of the month, and still he couldn't get that face out of his mind. The face of the woman in that old photo, hanging from the boy's neck. Augusto tried to rationalize. Told himself, it's just a coincidence, Augusto. It must be. Could be some woman who just looks like her. There are plenty of lookalikes in the world. But inside, he already knew that wasn't true. That little dimple at the corner of her smile, the soft shape of her nose, the slightly messy bangs, there was no denying it. It was her. For a moment, he wanted to laugh at himself. He, Augusto, always used to giving orders, controlling, deciding. Now here he was, sweating, rattled by nothing but a worn necklace on the neck of a dirty boy who probably couldn't even remember his own mother's name. He should have called the police, settled things right away, as he did with company problems. Deal with it and move on. But he hadn't. Something wouldn't let him. The finance chief's voice droned into the office, talking about contracts, numbers, deadlines. Augusto nodded, pretending to listen, but barely heard anything. Only flashes appeared, Pedro's terrified face, the fear, his big eyes, the way he clutched the photo to his chest as if it were a talisman against all the world's evil. When silence returned, he looked at the window. The sky was still gray and heavy, rain slithering slowly down the glass. It was a cold day, the kind that made the city look even uglier, with shrunken trees and the wind hitting harsh. Augusto wondered where the boy was now. Had he found another car to hide in? Was he still hungry? That battered backpack likely held nothing but a few clothes, maybe a broken toy. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, forced his memory. That woman, how long ago now? More than 8 years, certainly. He remembered the last time he saw her, her eyes full of anger and sadness at the same time. So much had happened since then, mistakes, accusations, but there was no way she could be here again, like that, locked in a street boy's necklace. Augusto leaned back in his chair, tried to breathe deep. A few seconds later, the door opened again. This time it was his assistant, flustered. Mr. Augusto, the people for the online meeting are waiting. Should I connect you now? He nodded, nearly on autopilot. The computer lit up, faces appeared on the screen. Everyone expecting him to talk, to command, to smile, the usual. But inside, Augusto felt like someone else. He felt small. The feeling was overwhelming. He tried to muster his usual strong voice, but realized it was slow, dragged out. He misstated an important figure, almost forgot a long-time client's name. A few people exchanged odd glances on the screen, but no one said a thing. During the meeting break, he used the time to search his phone, digging through old photos, trying to find some explanation. He wanted to see if he was overreacting, if he wasn't just mixing up memories like mistaking a soap opera face for someone real. But the more he looked, the more sure he felt. That woman was her. But the boy? Why would he have a photo of her? Why would he wear it around his neck like a shield? It didn't add up. Augusto caught himself thinking again about how harshly he'd spoken to the boy that morning, practically throwing him out of the car. He should have been calmer. Maybe he should have asked the right questions. He'd recognized something different about him, but pride in his habit of keeping things at a distance had spoken louder. He felt a stabbing guilt. It was an old feeling, but he knew it right away. He hated this. He gazed out at the rain again, and suddenly, almost involuntarily, pictured himself walking down the street, shoes soaked, crossing the same sidewalks where the boy was probably scrounging for bits of bread, trying to escape the wind. The hours ticked by. The clock kept going, almost mocking him. But Augusto couldn't get the image out of his head. The doubt grew, turning into anguish. No matter how much he tried to focus on work, at every tap of rain against the window, at every tired face on his screen, he was pulled away, back to the past, to what he might have left undone. He sat through lunch break, right there. The phone on the desk. Inside, an odd urge to leave, search for the boy, ask, demand an answer, or simply look at that medallion again, try to understand all of it. On impulse, teenager-like, he started typing her name into Google. He searched social media, old records. He hoped for some loose thread, any bit of information from all those missing years. But nothing turned up but silence. His blood warmed, an anxious old feeling. He remembered her pregnant, their last fight, how different paths pulled them apart. He still tried to find some logic, a clear reason why all this was resurfacing now. But no answer came. Surrounded by modern computers, glass, polished marble, expensive coffee, he felt absurdly alone, as if life itself was mocking his wealth. What was the point of it, in the end, if so much still hurt for no reason? One thing was clear that day. Augusto wasn't going to be able to pretend he hadn't seen. He couldn't force normality anymore. Curiosity, laced with that old fear, wouldn't let him go. He needed an answer, needed to understand what that boy, in that old photograph, really meant. The car was still parked in front of Augusto's building. The sun barely up, but the city was already hustling, honks, hurried voices everywhere. Augusto stood by the car, a heavy gray coat on his shoulders, eyes fixed on the open back door. It was as if the boy's smell had lingered there, mixed with expensive leather and woody cologne, shy, almost undetectable, but impossible to ignore. The driver, Joel, showed up awkwardly, fiddling with the keys and glancing at Augusto out of the corner of his eye, unsure whether to speak or wait. There's always this tension between boss and employee in these weird moments. Augusto spoke first, his voice dry. Find that boy. He can't have gone far. Search around here, plazas, snack bars, wherever these street kids sleep. If you find him, call me immediately. Joel just nodded, asking no questions. He grabbed his jacket, pulled his beanie over his ears, and hurried off onto the cold sidewalk, eyes scanning the building's shadows. The sky was milky gray, the wind bit, the kind that stings the skin, harder still when all you have is a thin shirt, like Pedro last night. Augusto stayed there, letting the manufactured warmth slowly leave his body. He stuffed his hands in his pockets and stared at the ripped backpack left on the car floor. That image struck him. Frayed fabric, a plastic teddy bear attached to the zipper, the photo of the woman he hadn't seen in ages. Impossible not to think of her. Dark hair, that shy smile, gentle hands. She'd vanished from his life out of nowhere, like a letter in the rain, never explained. Their ending just hanging, a bitter taste of injustice and words unsaid. Augusto tried to push the memories away, but the questions jabbed at him. How did that boy have her photo? Why did he wear it around his neck, clinging to it amidst all his misery? Was it just a coincidence? Or fate shoving everything in his face again? Behind the face of a cold businessman, too rich to believe in miracles, Augusto's chest clenched. There was anger there, and shame, and a sadness he'd spent years pretending not to feel. He remembered the day she left, how he stared at the door, waiting for her to come back laughing, saying it was just a scare. But she never came back. Then came the gossip, talk that she'd moved away, found another job, disappeared completely. Augusto hadn't searched for her. Pride, maybe. Cowardice. Always work. Business. Always another meeting. Always something pressing, always an excuse not to face the void she'd left behind. Now that void felt bigger. Guilt gnawed at him, tangled with uncontrollable anxiety. He had no idea who the boy was, yet he felt like he needed to protect him from something. It seemed absurd. An experienced businessman, owner of so much, heart pounding over a filthy boy running from the cold. Every couple of minutes, Augusto checked his phone. No message, no call from Joel. Time sped up as he glanced at the street, then froze, heavy, like lead, as he tried to think. On the sidewalk, people rushed by, families taking kids to school, women sweeping shop fronts. Nobody even noticed another lost boy. Not here, in this sea of indifference. He closed the car door slowly and headed up to the office. Walked the halls carrying his own body like a burden. The luxurious furniture and expensive paintings felt hostile. He sat in the meeting room, but didn't so much as glance at the computer. He just stared at the blank tablet, remembering her smile and the days when he thought happiness was possible, before the divorce, before ugly fights over nothing. The image of the boy, huddled up like a wounded animal, wouldn't leave his head. He remembered the terrified look when he woke him that morning. There was something different about him compared to other street kids. A stubborn innocence, big round eyes, his chest gently rising and falling beneath a thin blanket and a battered backpack. For a moment, Augusto wanted to throw out all the reports, forget the numbers, run screaming out onto the street to find Pedro himself. It sounded insane, but the idea came back with a force every time he thought of that old car door in the parking garage. That guilt, it grew, twisted his stomach, left a bitter taste in his mouth. A nagging sense that there was some explanation for all of this that he needed to uncover, even if it hurt. From the office window, Augusto watched life pass by, rain starting fine on the glass, people rushing, everyone with their own drama, their own hidden struggles. He wondered how many Pedros there were in that city, how many boys sleeping scared and cold, hungry, holding the last bit of hope in their hands, a photo, an old toy, a story no one knew. He rubbed his face, tired. A solitary tightness took hold of him. For the first time in years, he wished everything could be different. When the phone finally vibrated, Augusto almost dropped it in surprise. His heart pounded, his hand shook. He answered, his voice low, trying to sound steady. "You found him." The silence on the other end felt endless. Until Joel spoke, hope mixing with fear for what he might hear. Traffic was typical, horns blaring, exhaust on the air, people rushing across the street, dodging cars. The sky still wore its winter gray, threatening rain, a chill that crept even into tightly shut cars. Augusto sat in the back, window half down, staring out with his chest tight, masking his anxiety. He gripped his jacket at the chest, face tense, that guarded look of someone not sure whether to run or move forward. The driver nodded with his chin toward the traffic light. "Over there, boss." Augusto followed his gaze, taking a few seconds to spot him among the cars, a thin, small boy, clothes stained in old gray, a torn beanie pulled low. Pedro. He was standing still, holding out a little box of candy, moving from car to car, a soft voice asking, "Miss, want some candy, please?" Most people rolled up their windows, pretended not to even see him. There was such a deep sadness in that boy. Hollowed-out eyes, the way he gripped the box like it was a lucky charm. Sometimes Pedro looked straight at the driver's face, all fear, like he expected to be shouted away or snatched by some adult. Augusto told the driver to pull over. His palms were sweating lightly, a dull ache in his chest. Before opening his door, he paused for a few seconds, just observing. It was as if his whole life were tightening in his throat. Pedro saw the car pull up. He recognized right away that big man, starched up, in nice shoes, looking like someone who never wanted for anything. Instinctively, he began to draw back, pressing himself against the wall by the lamppost, clutching the box to his chest as if it could ward off everything. Eyes wide, chin trembling, that pure animal fear of a child always ready to run. But Augusto didn't rush him, didn't move like a threat. He stood a bit away, almost afraid to scare him further. He took a breath, lowered his voice, dropping the authority. No orders, nothing harsh. He simply said, almost a whisper, "Pedro, I brought something for you to eat." In his hand was a small bag. Wrapped sandwich, water bottle, some cookies. Nothing fancy, but real food. The boy eyed it with such mistrust that it broke Augusto's heart. He waited. Pedro measured him top to bottom, scanning for traps that weren't there. He was silent for a few seconds. The light turned green. Cars rolled past, horns blared. The city sped away from the two of them. Augusto stayed quiet. He just placed the bag on the ground, not moving closer. He stepped back, hands open, as if giving up everything, even his pride. His once stern face now trembled slightly at the mouth. A bitter doubt. Was it already too late? Pedro eyed the bag hungrily. His stomach ached. The night before, he tried to sleep under a tarp, listening to the rain drumming on concrete, cold wind biting in from all sides. He'd been out since dawn, holding up his box, dealing with the grind of no's, of harsh stares. He'd hardly sold anything. The sandwich in that bag promised a little relief, but it also felt like bait. So he asked, his voice thin and wary, not meeting Augusto's eyes, "What do you want with me?" He trembled, but tried to act tough. The question landed in Augusto's gut like a punch. It hurt more than he expected. He watched the boy, Pedro, gripping his candy with one hand and his battered backpack with the other, ready to run if anyone tried to grab him. For a few seconds, Augusto couldn't answer. He wanted to say something comforting, but only managed a sigh, a downward glance, the defeat of someone destroyed by past mistakes. "I just want you to eat, Pedro. That's all for now." The words came out weak, almost an apology. Augusto didn't manage a smile, just stood there a bit hunched, hands in his pockets, eyes flicking to the street, the cars, the loaded sky. Pedro hunched over his backpack, eyes darting around like a cornered animal. Nobody cared. People passed by, lost in their own worlds, missing the tiny, huge moment. He hesitated, but hunger outweighed fear. He crept forward, took the bag, opened it. The smell of the sandwich made his eyes well up, though he did his best not to show it. He ate in a hurry, but kept his eyes on Augusto the whole time, ready to drop everything and bolt if any danger showed up. The bread barely made it down, so strung out was he with anxiety. The cold wind scratched his dirty face, but just then, inside the bite, there was a bit of warmth. It felt strange. No one had ever given him food like this before. No price, no blows, no insults. Augusto watched every move, every bite. You could see how hard he was fighting not to cry. The big, arrogant man seemed smaller now, like someone standing face to face with an old pain tearing its way back in. Every tremor of Pedro's hand reminded Augusto of all those nights when he'd felt alone too but pretended he didn't. Now, looking at the boy, he asked himself, how did I let it get this far? The silence between them was heavy, but it didn't threaten. It was crowded with messy history, past choking off words. Augusto wanted to say something else, but had no idea where to begin. What could you possibly offer a lost, suspicious kid who just wanted to survive? Pedro, still not finished eating, looked at Augusto with that doubt carved into his eyes. If I eat, you're gonna make me leave afterwards, aren't you? Anyone passing by might have thought it was just some random chat at a stoplight. But right there, it was the collision of two lives torn apart by pain. The boy's hope, stitched to his hunger, the man's guilt, nailed in place by silence. Finally, the drizzle started, soft and steady, and Pedro barely seemed to notice. He stayed alert, bracing for reality to hurt him again. And Augusto, standing under that gray sky, felt his life shifting in a way that maybe could never be undone. It was already past 9 at night, but the office was so quiet it might as well have been the middle of the night. Augusto sat in the big chair behind his desk, the one that always used to make him a little proud. But now, his body was slumped. He seemed smaller than ever. He only stared at Pedro, sitting right on the edge of the couch as if he didn't trust it. The silence pressed in like a weight. Distant urban noise drifted up, muffled by the thick window glass. But really, all anyone could hear was their own heartbeat. Outside, the city's lights tried in vain to break the night's sadness. But inside, everything felt stuck, as if waiting for something about to happen. Augusto, awkward, crossed his arms, looked at the window, then at the ceiling, and then back to the boy, not sure what gesture to make. His throat was tight. He could hear his own slightly nervous breathing. As for Pedro, he was silent, a little shaky, but who knew if it was from cold or fear? He clutched his backpack like treasure, though it held nothing but a kid's messy odds and ends and dirty clothes. Augusto's eyes landed on the chain around Pedro's neck. Suddenly, the words came. Can I see it again? The little necklace. Can I look at the photo? Pedro hesitated, staring at the floor. He grasped the chain as if afraid of losing the last piece of himself. But slowly, he lifted it over his head, placing it in Augusto's hand with a sort of tentative trust, like he didn't mean to. When Augusto took the photo, his hand shook. It wasn't just the cold, not just exhaustion, it was memory coming back to hurt. He opened the locket, his fingers gentle, and gazed at the faded, crooked image. Her face. The smile from a time that was gone for good. Suddenly his eyes went hard, then quickly blurred. Augusto felt a knot rising in his throat. He swallowed it, closing his eyes for a few seconds, so as not to cry in front of the boy. In that moment, it was as if he were 20-something again, full of dreams and not much money. What was your mother like, Pedro? His voice broke, low as a whisper. Pedro looked at him, startled. The boy was quiet for a bit, rifling through memory. She was nice. She played with me. She'd sing when I couldn't sleep. He started out softly, speaking like someone afraid to get it wrong. We lived in a place of our own. Small, but it smelled like fresh bread in the mornings. Sometimes she'd get sick, but she smiled anyway. She said everything would be fine, as long as we had faith. She liked to draw. She'd laugh when I fell in the street, but give me a big hug after. Augusto listened with clenched hands, the little necklace sliding between his fingers. His chest burned, each word hurting more than the last. He wanted to ask more, to say, I know, but he held back. All he could do was see the boy, without daring to interrupt. Pedro spoke on, settling the backpack in his lap, his eyes fixed on the little salamander on the office stove, as if talking just to himself. She'd give me baths, telling stories. Sometimes I could make her laugh. Then she started to get really tired, always coughing. She bought me this necklace, told me not to lose it. So if I ever ended up alone, I'd remember there was love in it. Pedro's voice faded, eaten by longing. He rubbed a hand across his eyes, as if refusing to cry in front of someone else. Augusto said nothing. He only closed the locket with tenderness, rare even with his own wallet. His large hand lingered over the photo for a moment. Augusto's eyes blurred with tears, shining in that way men try to hide. Inside, his chest was chaos. Pain, anger, an old emptiness rushing back in. There was no denying it, she was right there. Her scent returned, memories like an avalanche. For a second, he forgot why money, fancy cars, and all those walls mattered. The silence grew heavier. Pedro glanced at Augusto's hand and then at his backpack. The boy's gaze was hard, but so fragile. Augusto fiddled with the locket, every awkward movement saying what his words couldn't. Deep down, Augusto thought of all the unsaid things. He was supposed to have been the one beside her. What would his life have been if 2 or 3 choices had gone differently? Now, sitting before his own son, even without knowing for sure, one look at the photo, one look at the boy's face, and feeling nothing was impossible. Lost, Pedro kept tugging at a loose thread on his backpack zipper, eyes down. She said that when things got really hard, I should pray and wait for someone good. The office clock sounded out, cutting through the hush. Augusto blinked slowly, let out his breath just as slow, searching for some strength. On the outside, he looked like that solid, posturing stone, but if you watched closely, you'd see it in his face, especially the way he stared at the photo. Everything inside him was coming undone. He was a father, in a strange way, to a boy he'd never expected, but suddenly, everything around him began to shift. Augusto gently handed the necklace back to Pedro. Their eyes met for an instant, a flash of understanding passing between them. Pedro took it with a kind of respect, almost gratitude, and put it back on. No one said a word for a long moment. It was the kind of silence that says more than anything else. Outside, the city kept going, traffic moving and horns blaring, but inside that office, it was as if only the two of them existed, and a story too old to fix in a day. When Augusto finally looked at Pedro again, all he managed was a sigh. The beginning of a sob, but with no tears yet. And Pedro, for all he was so young, seemed to understand that something important had just happened. Right then, both of them knew their lives were more entwined than either had ever wanted to admit. Augusto woke up early that morning, but not because of the alarm. It was that restless feeling, a weight in his chest that wouldn't let him settle. The sky was cloudy, a dingy gray smearing the apartment windows. He skipped the coffee. His mind was fixed on one thing. The DNA test had arrived. It sat on the console table in a white envelope, the lab's little logo printed in one corner. It looked like a regular envelope, but for Augusto, it weighed like a stone. He stared at it for a while, standing still, heart thumping too fast, a chill creeping down his back. The same hands that used to sign anything without hesitation now shook for real. On the living room couch, Pedro rummaged through his torn backpack. He didn't really seem to understand what was happening. He just watched Augusto with sleepy, curious eyes, nervously sucking on his jacket sleeve. It was freezing outside, and even in the apartment, the silence gave you goosebumps. Augusto picked up the envelope carefully, as if it might explode or shout something at him. Just for a second, he thought about dropping everything and running for good. He wondered what he'd do if the answer was yes, or if it was no. Both scenarios slammed into him, and he couldn't say which one hurt more. He took a deep breath, tried to steady his trembling hands. It did no good. Pedro stayed perched, quiet. He barely blinked. Just watched Augusto, trying to figure out the strain etched on his face. There was no need to say anything. The boy felt the tension like a thick fog. That sensation of waiting, of something huge that couldn't be explained. Augusto ran his fingers across the envelope seal, slowly. The sound of paper tearing seemed far too loud, echoing across the big room that suddenly felt too small. He stood there with the paper in his hand, reading the cold black words. His eyes darted between the lines, searching for the truth written there, no way to dodge it. And in that instant, it hit him. There was no more doubt. The answer was clear. The boy in front of him, the same one who'd hidden in his car to escape the cold, was the son he'd never known existed. Augusto felt everything collapse at once. The anger, the hurt, the loneliness, the pride. All of it shrank before what he'd just discovered. It was like a punch to the gut. He staggered a little, suddenly drained. He sank to his knees on the carpet, the envelope still clutched, head bowed. He couldn't hold back. The tears came hard, even though he tried to swallow them. His chest shook, short spasms, each tear washing away a bit of some old guilt he hadn't even known he carried. Pedro was startled. He had never seen a grown man cry like that. He wasn't sure whether he should go over or ask what was happening. He stood stock still, clutching his backpack, eyes wide. The silence was thick. You could only hear the muffled sobbing, the rough sound of Augusto's breathing, and the wind outside bumping against the window, as if it wanted to peer inside too. Augusto remembered Pedro's mom, her simple way, her gentle smile, their last conversation, so full of harsh words, and that stupid pride that drives real lovers apart. Now he understood what she'd carried all alone. He felt a crushing shame, a bittersweet longing, and a crazy wish to turn back time and do it all differently. The paper slipped from his grasp, landing crumpled on the carpet. Augusto wept silently now, just letting the tears fall. His face, usually so stern and unflinching, looked fragile, almost childlike. He was a big, wealthy man, but right then he was as lost as Pedro. Pedro didn't know what to do. He wanted to get up and hug him, the way his mother did after nightmares. But fear held him back. What if he got it wrong? So he clenched the chain at his neck, that tiny photo all he had of his past. He wanted to ask why Augusto cried so much, but he stayed quiet. Tom stood still. A little bird landed on the windowsill outside, chirping softly, as if it too sensed the tension of the moment. The street was empty, only a few cars passing below, their horns lost in the cold wind. Inside, there were just these two broken worlds, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. Augusto couldn't get up. He knelt there, breathing deep, trying to piece everything together. He thought about the boy asleep in the back seat, fleeing a cold he'd never imagined himself. He thought about the years he'd thrown away, his stupid pride, how he let life become nothing but deals and money, when none of that was worth a hug from his own son. At last he raised his eyes to Pedro. His gaze was red, tired, but something new was there, a silent apology, a flicker of courage, an awkward kind of love trying to grow through the crack in the asphalt. Pedro didn't really understand, but he felt it. He saw in Augusto's face that something major had changed. They stayed that way, looking at each other. Neither knew what to say. The world paused, sadness mixed with hope. In the silence of that big cold room, father and son finally felt a little less alone. Dawn came with a dirty gray sky, the kind the city knew all too well. The street still wet from the night air, everything colder than it should be. The garage's air was harsh, silent, smelling of expensive cars and oil. Augusto looked at Pedro like he was trying to see beyond the boy in front of him. He looked exhausted, eyes red, dark rings like lead under them. He was nothing like the man who made deals by barking orders. He seemed smaller, almost vulnerable. But he had to do something. No more hesitation, no more waiting for fate, no more pretending he wasn't connected to this boy. Without saying much, truthfully, barely able to speak, Augusto placed a hand on Pedro's shoulder. His fingers closed slowly, hesitantly, as if he'd forgotten how to touch, how to care. Pedro noticed, but didn't know how to react. He stood, clutching the strap of his battered backpack, the chain with its photo peeking out of his grimy shirt. He eyed everything warily, like a skittish animal used to running in the night. After a moment, Augusto just said they were leaving. He opened the car door and gestured, offering a world that made no sense. Pedro climbed in, silent. The leather seat felt otherworldly soft. He wasn't sure whether to lean back or sit up straight. All he knew was that it was warm, so different from the cold ground he'd gotten to know these last few nights. When Augusto opened the window, a blast of cold air came in, laced with the aroma of bread and gasoline, hurried people outside. Pedro noticed everything, afraid it could all vanish at any second. Augusto's house was enormous in that intimidating way. The gate opened slowly with a shriek. The glass and concrete facade made it obvious someone important lived there. Inside, it was so quiet Pedro nearly bolted. It felt like a museum. Footsteps echoed, the furniture gleamed. Flowers sat in a vase on a marble table, a lamp stood unlit. No family photos, no kids' toys. Just the two of them in tension, thick in the air. Pedro missed the noise of people, the barking of the stray dog at the park where he sometimes slept, his mother's whispering voice telling him stories. Augusto led the way but kept glancing back, making sure Pedro followed every step. He'd never brought anyone here before. He didn't know whether he should offer water, food, or even a hug. His life had become all about gate codes, packed schedules, cold meetings. He'd never tried to explain his house to a child. In the kitchen, Augusto just stood there, searching for courage in the cold stone countertop. He opened the cabinet slowly, found a mug, hesitated, No one had touched a colorful mug in here in years. He heated some milk, spilled a little, swore under his breath, and suddenly realized Pedro was watching, very quietly. Pedro took the cup with both hands, not caring if it was hot or not. He looked at the mug as if the warmth could do more than just heat his body. He sipped slowly. Augusto lingered by the sink, keeping an eye on him from above, unable to hide the emotion. As strange as it was to admit it, he wanted to comfort Pedro, but didn't know how. He watched to see if the boy would spill milk, if he needed a refill, but didn't dare ask what he really needed. Pedro's stomach rumbled loud, cutting through the silence. Augusto moved, opened the fridge, got out bread, cheese, whatever seemed to make sense. He thought about apologizing for not having kid food, cookies, yogurt, but didn't know how to begin. Pedro only nodded a thank you, eyes always downcast. Sitting there eating quietly, Pedro only wanted his mom. When he realized he wouldn't hear her voice again, he tried swallowing the tears, failing at it. He looked at Augusto, fearing he might get scolded. But Augusto noticed, and without knowing quite what to do, pulled over a chair and sat nearby. They stayed like that for a while. Time felt slow, almost painful, as if the clock itself was scared to keep moving. After breakfast, Augusto showed him the room he'd thrown together in a hurry. It wasn't much, just a big bed, clean sheets, beige curtains, a hint of fabric softener. Pedro set his backpack in a corner, scanned the place for anything warm or welcoming. He found nothing. He sat on the edge of the mattress, fiddling with his necklace, staring at the floor. He missed his mother's arms, the smell of soap on her apron, the faint music that sometimes drifted in from the neighbor's window. Augusto stayed by the door, gripping the knob tightly. He wanted to say so much, but none of the words came. He only asked if Pedro needed a blanket, his voice shaky. Pedro sensed the effort, nodded, saying it was fine, but his eyes betrayed a longing too wide and deep to name. When Augusto closed the door, he paused in the empty hall. He looked at a forgotten photo atop a side table, remembered the smile of his old flame, the guilt, the time wasted. He squeezed his eyelids tight, wiped away a quick tear, too proud for anyone to see. But inside, only doubt, fear of messing up again, a desperate wish to get it right at least once with this new son. The house felt even fuller of silence now. Every step of Pedro's echoed in the icy rooms. But deep in Augusto's hard eyes, something new began to stir. A kind of care, a kind of promise. He couldn't explain it. And Pedro, wearing his ragged t-shirt, shivering even under the blanket, stared out the window at the dark sky, hoping, against all the odds, that maybe this time he'd get to stay. Even weighed down by longing, even without understanding why, he felt something new starting to grow, tiny and slow, in that immense silence. Augusto's phone wouldn't stop buzzing that morning. Messages, calls, lawyers' notifications, acquaintances, people from work. He felt his chest squeezed tight, like a weight pressed there ever since everything changed. Pedro was in the living room, sitting on the carpet, quietly playing with an old toy car someone from the building had left for him. The boy barely made a sound, and Augusto found himself watching him the way you try to remember an old childhood song. Just when the details come close, they slip away. Outside, the city seemed not to realize what was happening inside. The rush had already started. Honking horns, sirens. It was gray, damp, that cold that seeps into your bones even with the window closed. Augusto stood from his chair and slowly crossed the hall. He drew a long breath, knowing he had to be strong. He had to be different from the cold man he'd always been. The doorbell rang suddenly. It was like thunder exploding in Augusto's chest. Peering through the peephole, he saw two men in suits, lawyers, and a woman, a family acquaintance he'd never had much patience for. The way they carried themselves said they thought they were better than everyone else. Augusto stood frozen for just a second, wishing desperately to shout at them to go away, but he didn't. He pulled open the door, faced them. "Augusto, we need to talk," the older one said, glancing at his watch as if drama was a waste of time. "This is reckless. You haven't thought through the consequences. He's a street kid, Augusto. You can't just bring him home like a stray dog." The words landed like stones. Augusto felt a surge of anger, heat rising up his neck. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Pedro standing in the doorway, clutching the toy car. "Nobody's going to take him from me," Augusto replied, his voice low but steady. One of the women sighed, as if she'd expected this. She brandished stacks of papers, started talking about responsibilities, media risk, legal issues, terms that had once meant something, but now rang hollow. This could damage your reputation, your work. Think about your name, she whispered. Augusto tried to listen, but his gaze shot from one face to another, always returning to Pedro, standing so small in the middle of it all. The boy didn't understand half of what was being said, but he was scared. His eyes were those of a bird who's already suffered too much to believe anyone when they say it'll be okay. Augusto felt his chest ache. I'm not giving up on him, he said again, stronger now. He raked a hand through his hair, started pacing, legs shaky. The lawyers exchanged skeptical looks. One of them pulled out their cell phone, threatening to call a judge they knew. They spoke of emergency custody, psychological evaluations, witnesses. Pedro clung tighter to his car, bracing for another eviction. Augusto went to the boy, knelt down. It's okay. Stay here with me. I won't let anyone take you away, he murmured. The lawyers looked shocked, as if they'd never seen Augusto like this before. He'd been famous for being ruthless, impossible, even cruel in business. Now he was on his knees in front of 3 strangers, willing to beg to keep a son he'd nearly lost. Suddenly his phone rang again. On the other end, the court. The voice was serious, heavy. They wanted to know what was happening, why Augusto had skipped all the official steps, why the children's services hadn't been notified. Augusto answered firmly, not hiding his fear. He said he'd comply with everything, but Pedro didn't belong in a shelter. He's my son, my blood. I made plenty of mistakes, but not anymore. The family woman gave him a sad look, as if mourning all the money Augusto might lose. But Augusto didn't care. For the first time, money, company, appearances, none of it meant a thing. He was thinking only of Pedro. Warnings came in, lawsuits, nasty comments. Some called Augusto crazy. Others said he'd regret it. No one understood. For him, there was no choice left. Either he fought for Pedro, or he'd go back to the empty shell he'd been before. And that emptiness, he could no longer abide. A painful silence descended. Pedro looked up at the tall, wealthy man as if searching for hope in his eyes. Augusto felt the boy's fear and remembered his own lonely nights after the divorce, all those meaningless mornings. Now, each one needed the other. Augusto felt his knees go weak, almost, but he didn't back down. He said, quietly, almost just to himself, they'll never understand. They've never lost a child and found him again. Pedro said nothing. He just rested his head lightly on Augusto's arm. So much trust, and so much fear, wrapped up in that single movement. Augusto felt his eyes burn but held back the tears, not in front of everyone. Somebody threatened to call the police if Augusto didn't surrender Pedro to the shelter. Augusto stood tall, steadier than he'd ever been. He said he'd fight to the end, in court, in the street, wherever it took. I'll fight for him, I swear. Do whatever you want, but he's not leaving here. The words came out hard, slicing the air. Head down, Pedro let out a quiet breath. He hugged his ragged backpack. His face was drawn, his eyes tired from too much crying on the inside, from hoping someone would stay, just once. Rain began to drum on the window, gentle, cold, like the hard nights Pedro had survived. But in there, beneath all the fear, a new warmth was taking hold, the warmth of someone finally willing to stay. Augusto knew there was more ahead, judges, reporters, old enemies. But nothing seemed as scary as the thought of losing Pedro again. He would fight with everything he had. No more running from pain, from the past. Now, he was Pedro's father, and he wouldn't let anyone, or anything, tear apart what the world had just returned to his arms. Augusto woke before the sun, unusual for someone who always set his life's clock by a routine of meetings. The silence in that house still weighed heavily. That calm felt like the quiet before a storm, but it was just different. Pedro was asleep in the next room, tangled up in the covers, hair sticking up, his brow furrowed as if sleep had not yet proved shelter enough from the nightmares of the street. In the kitchen, Augusto opened the fridge, a simple thing, but he hesitated over where to look. He'd never really thought about what a boy would eat for breakfast. He got lost among expensive jars of imported jam and a cheese whose name only he knew. He rubbed his face, tried to recall what he'd heard about kids, but all he could remember were the shouts of his own childhood, his distant father, his mother weighed down by sorrow. He grabbed some bread, poured some milk. He broke the silence in the most basic way, ripped open a bag of sandwich bread, almost tearing it, clumsy. He thought about calling the maid, but felt embarrassed. He wanted to do it himself, even though he knew nothing about little people or real food. He buttered the bread, a bit unevenly, heated up the milk, and stared at it all, as if breakfast might be the touch-up his life needed to finally set things right. He heard footsteps. Pedro appeared slowly in the doorway, clutching the necklace with his mother's photo as if it were a shield. Augusto held himself back from offering the boss's stare, but the boy just stood there, as if afraid to cross the line where the hallway light ended and the kitchen began. Pedro sniffled, hair sticking to his forehead, his eyes heavy with that old tiredness that shouldn't belong to an 8-year-old. "I made breakfast for you," Augusto said, his voice coming out quiet, almost apologetic. Pedro didn't answer, but came over slowly and sat down. He kept his backpack on his lap, as if everything there might disappear in the blink of an eye. I'm not good at this." Augusto tried again, gesturing to the bread and milk. "Never made it, for anyone." Pedro picked up a slice, took a small bite, watching Augusto from the corner of his eye, on guard, as if he already knew the danger that comes with too much adulthood. Minutes dragged by, only the ticking clock and the sound of Pedro chewing, quietly. Augusto wanted to break down that wall, the distance between them, but he was afraid of all he carried: guilt, shame, and that echo of loneliness now seeming even louder with such a small witness present. Augusto wrestled for words. He had never asked forgiveness from anyone. He'd always thought apologizing was a sign of weakness, a luxury for those unsure of their own worth. But now, looking at that skinny little boy, so brave to survive, but too small to ask for affection, everything was shifting. "Your name is Pedro, right?" he said softly. "Your mom was Fernanda? I made a lot of mistakes with her. And with you. I didn't even know you existed." Pedro's eyes darted to his, quick and wary. Augusto felt the weight of all that had kept father and son apart for so many years. It was like looking into a shattered mirror and seeing all that life had stolen from them both. Augusto wanted to say more, but stumbled over his thoughts. "I lied to myself, you know. Thought love was just another problem, afraid to lose, afraid I couldn't handle it." The boy shook his head, not quite understanding, but listening, curious about everything. And in that moment, Augusto saw it. Pedro wasn't waiting for pretty words or a life all fixed. He just wanted presence, to be heard, to be looked at without hurry, to eat every last crumb without fear of being sent away. Augusto's hand trembled, almost invisibly. He tried to pass Pedro the milk, but spilled some on the tablecloth, got lost in his own gestures. A thing that never happened in meetings or during billion-dollar decisions. He seemed like a little boy himself, testing his own boundaries. They sat in silence. In the background, the radio played some old song Augusto couldn't remember ever liking. He thought of lonely days, the echoing emptiness of the house, and felt an overwhelming urge to shout to the world that he didn't know how to be a father, but he wanted to try. He wanted to make up for every second. He couldn't travel back in time, but he could be here, now. "And you? What do you like?" he asked, voice far too gentle for someone who spent his life yelling to be respected. Pedro thought, gripped the little necklace tighter. "I like cartoons and dogs. And looking at the stars." Augusto caught himself smiling. How long had it been since he'd smiled for real? "There's plenty of room here. If you want, we can look at the stars together, maybe get a dog. You're the boss." Pedro lifted his gaze, for a moment unafraid. His face almost letting slip the dream of a home, any home, where he could lay down without fear of being slapped awake or thrown out. Augusto looked at the boy and felt his chest ache. The past was knocking at his door, the present begging for courage. "I'm sorry, Pedro," he blurted suddenly, softly. "Sorry I wasn't there before. Sorry I didn't believe in any of this. I want to try, make fewer mistakes, stay with you." Pedro said nothing. He just lowered his head, but the tears in his eyes said everything. The wall was starting to crack, just a sliver, between two wounded souls. Augusto got up, came around the table, almost stumbling over his own rawness. He thought about hugging Pedro, but didn't know how. He stood there, close, showing he wasn't going anywhere. Pedro took a deep breath, wiped his face on his sleeve. He finished his bread, sat waiting, as if bracing himself to believe for the very first time. The smell of coffee and bread in that little kitchen was, for both of them, their first real home. And there, in that unhurried morning, Augusto realized asking for forgiveness was no weakness, it was a beginning. And Pedro just wanted someone who'd stay, even on the coldest mornings. Pedro stood in the middle of the living room, not quite knowing what to do with so many new things. His eyes darted all around, trying to hug it all. The soft couch, the gentle light in the window, the rug that felt like a cloud. And for the first time in months, he wasn't looking around to find the quickest escape in case someone shouted at him. The smile on his face was so wide it must have hurt, as if the boy had even forgotten he could smile like that. Augusto stood in the doorway for a while, holding his briefcase, no idea where to put it. He watched Pedro with a mix of amazement and pride. He was no longer that hard man, always in a rush, always shut off, who didn't want to get attached to anyone. His chest felt full with a strange warmth. Heavy, almost uncomfortable, but good. The lawyer called early, confirming what they'd both dreamed of for so long. It was decided they could stay together, legally. The judge seemed to understand it was different this time. Augusto barely heard the rest of the call. All he could see was Pedro, who jumped into his arms and nearly knocked him over with happiness. In that moment, time stopped. Pedro, lighter than ever, eyes shining, his heart danced in his chest. He laughed with the wild delight of freedom, the sound filling the big house, bouncing off the walls, echoing, a sound the house hadn't heard in years. Not on Augusto's best days, not at those parties where he'd never really belonged. No one had ever made the house so alive. Pedro dropped his battered backpack in the hall and ran to the kitchen. He ran his hands over the chairs, sniffed the fruit bowl, opened the cupboard, and looked at everything as if it were treasure. He asked about everything. "What's this for? Can I eat this cookie? Can we make chocolate fudge?" Ernesto, the driver, came by to check on the commotion and became the boy's accomplice, grabbing a hidden pack of cookies for the two of them to share. Augusto took a while to find his voice. He sat on the edge of the sofa, eyes still wet. He forced a smile like he did at meetings, then let himself relax. His face changed for real. Worry lines faded, replaced by a calm he'd never known. Hands that always searched for his phone now lightly gripped the arm of the sofa, as if to make sure nothing would slip away. Rain tapped gently on the window that morning, but inside, it was all sunshine. Toys Pedro got as gifts were already scattering across the rug. The boy drew a house with colored pencils to hang on the fridge, right next to the note reading, "Don't forget meeting." The note soon disappeared behind a scribble full of color. Outside, the world seemed gray, traffic, horns, angry people. Inside, Pedro laughed. He pretended to be a dog, leaped up high, spun in circles until he was dizzy. He shouted "Dad" at the top of his lungs, trying out the word, like he couldn't believe he was allowed to use it. Augusto closed his eyes every time he heard it. The word hit deep, stirring up pain and joy, wounding and healing all at once. A new coffee smell came from the kitchen. Augusto got up, made hot chocolate, almost let the milk boil over, laughing at himself for getting it all wrong, but never wanting to give up. Pedro helped, cracking eggs for cake and making a mess, and in the end, they laughed even more. The boy grabbed a handful of flour and left a white mustache across his father's face. Augusto let him, laughing softly, pretending to protest, but the truth was he wanted that. The mess, the careless touch, the small chaos filled with love. When Pedro got tired, he clung to Augusto's legs, dragged a blanket from the couch, and curled up, watching cartoons on TV. Augusto looked at the scene, a lump in his throat. From time to time, he ran a hand over the boy's hair, not quite sure if he was doing it right, if he was allowed to give affection that way. But Pedro only smiled, falling asleep right against him, peaceful, like someone who trusts with eyes closed. At the end of the day, Augusto found an old photo of Pedro's mother. He sat with the boy on his lap and, in a whisper, promised never to leave him alone again. Pedro looked up at his father's face, said nothing, just pressed his head tighter against his chest. It was as if the years-long emptiness inside them both was finally starting to close. That night was unlike any other. At bedtime, Pedro asked to peek into his new room. He was scared of the dark, he whispered, so Augusto sat beside him, promising to stay there until he fell asleep. "I'm not going anywhere. Not ever again," he said, squeezing the small hand. Pedro stared up at the ceiling, eyes wet with exhaustion and hope. Augusto realized that, at last, he'd found meaning in his life. Everything he'd tried to fill with money, work, expensive parties, was empty next to that moment. Just him and his son, together. Silently, he promised himself, from here on, nothing else would matter more. The clock ticked softly. The house, once echoing and empty, was now filled with laughter, light footsteps, whispered dreams. Pedro fell asleep with a smile, his brow smooth, free of the burden of cold days on the street. Augusto watched him for a long time, eyes brimming, but for the first time, he cried out of pure pride and joy. That's how that house stopped being just a big, empty shell and became a true home, built piece by piece, with forgiveness, courage, and a love that had finally found its place to grow.